So last week we pretty much finished discussion of verse 7. So going forward, verses 8 through 17 is going to be our goal today. Whether or not we get all the way through that or not, I don't know, but we're going to try and speed up a little bit through some of this. So last week we covered our questions from question 2 and 3 specifically. What does weaker vessel mean? And of course, in addition to all the other suggestions, I also offered the idea that because husbands are in a position of authority, because God has said it that way, that puts the wife puts her in a vulnerable position. And so it requires that the husband not take advantage of that position, but in fact actually exalt and give honor to the wife. And then, of course, as we finish question 3, under what circumstances could prayers be hindered, and why does Peter mention this? We discussed the fact that the husband is to be the spiritual leader. He's supposed to be the one who kind of helps to guide to heaven. And, of course, ultimately, both souls are at stake. And so both the wife and the husband have to help each other get to heaven. And especially on the husband's side, if he's not taking care of that leadership role, then discouragement could creep in and cause prayers to be hindered. And so it's very important that everybody is doing what they should be doing, first of all, to serve God, and then certainly to serve one another. So going into verse 8. Verse 8, as Peter he's pretty much leaving behind the physical, I guess you could say the physical aspects for the most part in terms of the application of the principles he established back in chapter 2. He established our roles as citizens in this world, to the king, towards other people outside of the church. He established roles regarding servants and masters. He's established roles regarding husbands and wives. And to a certain extent, there is a continuation here in verse 8, but it's going to be more of a spiritual application than a physical one. He says, finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion for one another. Love as brothers, be tender-hearted, be courteous, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing, knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. So what's the next application or the next relationship to which he applies this principle of how Christians are to behave in the different relationships in which they find themselves in life? He's already dealt with non-Christians. He's dealt with kings and governments. He's dealt with servants and masters, husbands and wives. So what's this next one? Brethren, yeah. Yeah, and of course this is more of it's not just a physical aspect. There's certainly a spiritual part of this as well. So when he describes, for instance, having compassion for one another, certainly that is an application of love. There's a recognition, just as Jesus saw the multitudes and had compassion on them, there is a sense of both sympathy and to a certain extent empathy with regard to compassion, and a willingness to give of my own time, to sacrifice for others. Love as brothers, and of course this particular concept has its root in phileo. There's a reason why we call Philadelphia the what? City of brotherly love. Okay, this is actually, this is the same term, Philadelphia here. Love as brothers. Okay, there's this familial a family type of love that's applied here. In addition to agape and self-sacrifice, there's also the loving as a family, and that's what's being described here. Being tender-hearted and courteous. So that's the application of that family type of love. Because I love my physical family, I hope we're tender-hearted, I hope that we're courteous, and certainly there's the application of being compassionate. And so that application of love is shown in how we treat one another. So going to question 4, it applies to this first part of verse 8. Does one mind mean we all agree the same on every opinion? Notice not scripture, on opinion. No. Whether opinion has anything to do with what's going to happen when we die, for instance. Okay, I told the story about my grandfather thought he was going to sleep when he died. I said, well, you can sleep and I'll rest, because I believe we're going to rest. But the concept of having one mind does not mean that we think exactly the same about everything in life. And certainly this goes beyond just the application of Scripture. It goes into everything in life. Aspects of jobs and best ways of going about doing this or doing that. Certainly that's not what Peter's intending. What does one mind mean? If it doesn't mean that we're all of the same exact thought, that we don't think exactly the same thing on everything, then what does it mean?
My scripture says, or interpretation says harmonious, which I think is a good deal because you can be of one mind. You get along together to agree.
Okay. All right. So harmonious, I think, is a good application type term to use here. The idea of one mind. In what way, certainly there's, the idea of one mind carries with the sense of we have the same purpose, okay, and we have the same understanding of how to go about accomplishing that purpose. In the sense of, for instance, Scripture, okay, we all understand what it means to be baptized for the remission of our sins. We all understand what church organization means, what Bible authority means. And that one mind regarding that united purpose of getting to heaven, okay, that's where our goal is, that's what we want to get to. We are united together in that purpose. Now, outside of that purpose and outside of the means of obtaining that purpose, that doesn't mean we all think the exact same thing. You may want to paint the walls purple, I want to paint them garnet and black. Okay, we're going to have different ideas and different opinions on things that don't matter in the end. And that's okay. Okay, the idea of harmonious, even in occasions where we may differ in opinion on certain issues or matters, can we get along?
We make a choice.
Yeah, we make a choice. We can yield to one another. And that's part of what in Galatians chapter 5, that's part of that aspect of the fruits of the Spirit. Okay, there's certainly the implied yielding to one another. And of course, James deals with that in James chapter 2. Regarding James chapter 3, the wisdom that is from above, there at the end, the last couple of verses of James chapter 3. And so the idea of being of one mind, again, it is united in purpose and united on the means of obtaining that purpose. Okay, there is an understanding that we all have one together, one with another, of how to get to heaven, of how the church is to function, how it's to be set up, and so forth. But beyond that, there's certainly, we all are individuals, we all come from different backgrounds, and so we have seen things done certain ways that may be different than others. Okay, I know growing up, when the congregation that I attended growing up, we had our worship service in the middle, okay, kind of like we do here, before the sermon. The congregation across town had their worship service at the end, after the lesson. And I for whatever reason, I just always thought, well, that's just wrong. You can't do that. You have to have it before the sermon. And that's not the case. That's not the case. It doesn't really matter when during that service you have it. It could be the very first thing you do. So there's certainly different ways of still being of one mind. Yes, ma'am?
I'm certain from this verse, the one mind having to do with our attitude towards one another.
Sure.
That it has to do with we put the other person first, we love them, the way we treat them.
Right, absolutely. And that's the application that Peter uses of this concept of one mind. Throughout the New Testament, the idea of one mind comes up on a regular occasion. But every single time, the concept of one mind goes to the heart of why should we have compassion for one another? Why should we love as brothers? Because we all have the same purpose. We want to get to heaven. And we all understand how to go about doing that. And so the application of that, you're absolutely right. The application of being of one mind, since you're all in this together, okay, you all understand what the gospel says, then here's what that should mean for how you treat one another. Because having a certain mind or a certain thought process, that's an individual choice. but I have to align myself with my brethren, both in certainly in the recognition of what it means to get to heaven, but also in yielding in areas that, you know what, it doesn't really matter if y'all want to paint it pink, paint it pink. Okay? There's that sense of give and take. You stand for the truth, and you don't yield that, even for unity's sake. Okay? We don't sacrifice truth in order to obtain so-called unity. That's how the world works. That's how the religious community works. You know, it doesn't matter if we don't agree on Scripture, we'll all agree to disagree and just get along. That's not what Peter's describing here. He's describing one mind first in purpose and in means of fulfilling that purpose, and then one mind, as you applied there, one mind in attitude towards one another. But yeah, both of those certainly are there, absolutely. Any other thoughts to question 4?
We can have one mind, but we're all different people.
Yeah.
We have different abilities, different characteristics, and I think that what Chris said about harmony is usually different parts making something beautiful.
Yeah.
And that's what we can do for each other. Even parents, a father's love is different from a mother's love.
Yeah.
It's similar, but it has different qualities, and the child gets a harmony of love from their parents, and we can do the same for each other.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting when you apply the example of Paul and Barnabas in Acts chapter 15. Everybody remember what happened in Acts chapter 15 after the meeting with the apostles there in Jerusalem? What did Paul and Barnabas do? Huh? About John Mark, yeah. What happened?
The result was the gospel got spread a lot more places.
That's right. That was the end result. But there was a discussion, using that word lightly here, a discussion about whether or not John Mark should go along. Barnabas wanted to take him. Paul said, I don't want to take him because he refused to stay with us when we were in Asia Minor going about preaching and teaching that first time. And so Barnabas wanted to give John Mark a second chance. Paul decided he would take Silas and he would go his way, and then Barnabas and John Mark, they went to Cyprus. Does that mean that Paul and Barnabas weren't of one mind toward one another? First of all, did they still have the same purpose? Oh, in overall, certainly of getting to heaven, but even more specifically of teaching the gospel? Was that gospel, was what was going to be taught going to change? No. It was going to be the same. Whether it was Paul, Barnabas, John Mark, Silas, it didn't matter. It was still going to be taught the same. But did they have the same opinion about John Mark? No. They had a solution, that's right. Just because they went their own ways does not mean that they said, I hate you to each other and then stormed off. I propose to you that they still loved each other as brothers. But because they were so focused on that which they maybe that might be the wrong way to put it, but because they were so focused on what they deemed important, okay, Paul more so on being able to count on those they take with them for the teaching of the gospel's sake. Barnabas, as the name implies, he wanted to focus on encouraging while teaching the gospel. And in that particular instance, he and Barnabas and Paul could not do that together and have John Mark there. They couldn't accomplish both of their goals together of encouraging John Mark and preaching the gospel at the same time. So they just did it separately. And that's okay. That's all right. They were still of one mind. They still loved each other. And certainly Paul, eventually, did he come to see the value of John Mark after Barnabas gave him a second chance? Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And so there was a lot of good that came from that. And the gospel was taught in 2 different places, obviously, as well. So that's a great example of being united in purpose but differing on opinion. Okay, and that's one example where that certainly plays out. Anything else through verse 9? Or verse 8, sorry.
Michael, as you said a minute ago, agree to disagree. I was always taught in my boards, you need to agree to disagree agreeably. That way there is a harmony and...
Yeah, and in that particular instance, especially on a matter of opinion, like taking John Mark or not, okay, which it was important for John Mark, and it was important to Barnabas, it was important to Paul. But the focus was on teaching the gospel. And you're right, they did not agree on whether or not to take John Mark, but they disagreed agreeably. That's true. Yeah. And they didn't forget who they were in the midst of it. Yeah. All right. Question 5. What do the following terms, phrases mean? Compassion, love as brothers, tenderhearted, courteous. A lot of times we read these, and because of our modern way of using these terms, they seem like they're redundant. But that's not necessarily the case. These are all separate terms, Greek terms. So first of all, what is compassion? Yeah. There is a sympathy and an empathy, as we mentioned earlier, of kind of putting myself in their shoes, of considering another person's needs and being willing to sacrifice. Every time Jesus had compassion on someone, he followed it up with doing something for that person. Every example where he had compassion, there was a reason why. He's examining the multitudes as a sheep without a shepherd and so forth. There was always something that Jesus felt he needed to do to help them because of their situation. Okay, so compassion certainly applies, being able to put ourselves in the shoes of someone else and be able to understand and deliberate what this individual may need and how I can help them. Okay, that lends itself more to agape love. Okay, the idea of agape is self-sacrificial love. Loving as brothers, we already talked about Philadelphia. We talked about the idea of familial family, and how we love each other with regard to our physical family should be the same as our spiritual family. What about being tenderhearted and courteous? Let's start with courteous. A lot of times courteous, in our modern vernacular, the concept really just means polite. Whether you want to be or not, you're courteous if you're polite. You're well-mannered.
I think it's related to what Chris was saying, that disagree agreeably.
Okay.
I mean, you don't, it kind of goes with the next part, you don't be ugly to people.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah.
just because you disagree.
Right. The idea of courteous carries with it a sense of respect. Okay, it's not just opening the door for somebody because I was taught I have to open the door for people. No, there's what it should be. What those good manners should be done is out of a sense of respect for other people. Whether it's out of a sense of respect for our elders, out of a sense of respect for our brethren, the idea of courteous carries with it the idea of respect and honor. To that extent that I'm willing to show that in how I treat one another or how I treat others, in particular my brethren in this context. So how do you...
In the world we live today, people don't show respect unless they deem they deserve it.
Well, and in a lot of ways, they don't show it because they don't have it. It's one thing to have respect but not show it. It's another thing to not have respect at all. And unfortunately, in our society, it seems that more and more we come across individuals who all they really care about is themselves. They have no respect for other people or respect for the laws that keep us safe, or they are intended to keep us safe. People that only respect themselves, that shows in somebody's behavior. It shows in how they talk and what they do, the choices they make. So certainly a lack of courteousness or a lack of respect for others, it bears out. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, respect for others has to be taught. Respect for life, okay? Respect for human beings is something that unfortunately it seems a lot of our younger people in our society have lost sight of, given how much younger there are individuals who are doing terrible things to each other, okay? I mean, there are 10-year-olds shooting people and that sort of thing. It's crazy. It's crazy because that respect for others, that respect for human life in general just doesn't exist anymore. All of our kids are taught that they came from monkeys, so might as well behave like an animal.
Well, but it comes from their parents.
Oh yeah.
Their parents did not teach
Oh yeah.
respect because the school doesn't have as much influence
Oh yeah.
as the parent does.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. The application of parental responsibility certainly exists. And then you add to that the idea that these kids are taught that human life really doesn't have any value. It's like, shooting a dog or killing a deer or something, and it's just the same thing. All right, and then tenderhearted. Huh?
That's me.
That's you? All right, we'll define that as Myrna. What does tenderhearted mean?
Gullible.
No, not gullible. No, that's not you, Myrna. Huh? Caring. The concept of tender-hearted means that the heart easily is able to feel for others. Okay? The idea of caring is a part of it, and certainly there's aspects in which some of these connect to one another. But whereas compassion is having this self-sacrificial love, and loving his brothers is having family-type love, and courteousness is having a respect for others and allowing that to show, tender-hearted is distinguished from these other terms in the sense that I am willing to offer my heart, if you will, my emotional investment in others. It's not just agape, it's not just family. It's more of I'm freely able to connect with others. I'm freely willing to give of myself for others, separate from agape love. This is tenderhearted, speaks to the characteristic of my heart. Okay, I am freely able to express myself to others, and that kind of lends itself to caring to a certain extent. That I'm freely willing to show my care for others, so that kind of between all four of those terms, I mean that's pretty much the full extent of the human experience of compassion and love, and how we take care of each other and treat each other because of that love.
You can tell when somebody wants to be there and someone who doesn't want to be
Yeah.
there. But are there because they're obligated or forced or whatever, versus someone who wants to be there.
Yeah.
It shows in that tenderheartedness shows.
Well, and think about when you're asking somebody, or when somebody asks you, how you're doing. Especially if they know you've been having a rough time or whatever. Generally, you can tell if they really want to know, if they're really asking, or if they're just being polite and just saying it because that's what you say. Usually you can kind of tell that. And it's important that we are, and certainly a part of this as well is sincerity. Okay, tender-hearted also carries that sense of sincerity, a sense of honesty, straightforwardness. Okay. Anything else through question 5? Verse 9, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling. What did Peter discuss back in chapter 2? Whose example did he appeal to? Talking about Jesus, yeah. He appealed to Jesus and the fact that he did not revile in return. He was willing to endure persecution. And so as Peter applied that example, going back to chapter 1 and chapter 2, he utilizes that to describe especially the application of how we treat people outside of the body of Christ and being good citizens and so forth. But now he applies this towards one another. Okay, this is even more specifically applied when he says, do not return evil for evil or reviling for reviling. There's certainly, he's already made the application regarding people outside of the church. But even sometimes if you have a scenario where a brother or a sister does something bad, okay, whether they mean to or not, that's part of where this love for each other also carries forward. But on the contrary, verse 9, blessing, knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. Okay, there's the broad application, all right, of evil, don't return evil for evil and reviling for reviling, but there's also that specific application as well towards brethren. Question 6, to what were we called and how do we achieve this calling? When Peter says in verse 9, knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. To what were we called? He says to this.
Verse 8,
Okay.
just being of one mind. We call to this.
Okay.
Way of thinking, way of being, way of living.
Okay.
Not the negative side, which is verse 9.
Sure. Sure. And I agree that is, we have been called to be compassionate, to love as brothers, to be tenderhearted, to be courteous. That is certainly a part of that. But notice how he says in verse 9, we don't return evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but rather, in return for evil and reviling, what do we offer? Blessing. Okay? In what way do you apply that? I mean, we don't have the power to may ye be blessed. We don't have the power to do that. God does the blessing in that sense. Okay, if we could ask God to please bless our enemies, and so forth. But in what way, especially given the context of expression of how we act, how we conduct ourselves in the world? What do you and with our brethren in particular? What do you think he means? Not returning evil for evil, reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, we return blessing, knowing you were called to this.
In Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he uses the word bless many, many times at the very beginning of the Beatitudes.
Right.
And that word blessed means fortunate. And that's what we need to be to other people, is we need to be fortunate to them that we're in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
That we have all of these characteristics, that we are a blessing to others.
Okay, all right. Jesus said, blessed are you, right? Okay, blessed are you, and this is the idea of God has granted us some favor, okay, some blessing. All right, the idea that I am blessed is to acknowledge that God is taking care of me. All right, the idea of when we offer blessing, or in the sense that we return evil with blessing, the sense of it is that not only do we turn around when somebody does evil against us or reviling against us, that we do good to them. Okay, didn't Jesus also call for us to do that? Instead of evil to another person, let us do good. Okay, Paul says in Romans 13, or Romans 12 rather, to let evil be overcome by good. Okay, but that our character, our behavior is a blessing to others. It sounds as though that's what Peter's in particular, you were called to this. To what? To bless other people? Not in the sense that I have the power to bless people, but in the sense that my character, my example, and my words can be a blessing for others. Wasn't Jesus' character, and ultimately how that was expressed in his behavior or lack thereof, wasn't that a blessing for you and me? I mean, doesn't Peter utilize Jesus' example to show, since Jesus behaved this way in the face of those who meant him harm, be willing to suffer persecution and do the same? Well, in the same way, Peter's kind of just taking it down another application. You also be that example. You also allow your light to so shine, Matthew chapter 5. You let your example speak to what's in your heart. That is designed to be a blessing for others. That's what you were called to be. There's the specific application, certainly, of being compassionate and loving as brothers and tenderhearted and courteous and so forth in how we deal with others and how we deal with our brethren. But in a much broader sense, we have been called to be blessings to others, both to Christians, certainly, to be an encouragement, to edify, to uplift, to admonish at times, and also to people who aren't Christians. We have been called to be a blessing to others, not a curse. We've been called to be a blessing in the midst of and in the face of persecution, for instance. And so this is to what we have been called. We've been called to be a blessing to others, and we achieve that by allowing the example of Christ and the word that he gave us to live in our example, to be shown in how we talk and in how we act.
Just like you earlier in the chapter, when wives that didn't have believing husbands.
Yeah, absolutely.
It would be a blessing to him to even convert.
Right. Without a word, they may be won by the conduct of their wives. Absolutely. And it shows in a lot of ways. Not only is Peter addressing the responsibilities of Christians, but he's also addressing the opportunities that Christians have in these roles. I mean, if you think about it, in a lot of these ways, Peter's addressing these are opportunities for you. This isn't just some obligation of obeying the laws of men or obeying or acknowledging in the face of persecution the fact that you need to be faithful and so forth. It's the opportunities that also go with it. Yeah. Anything else to verse 9?
The first thing I thought of when I said that was the golden rule.
Yeah, yeah,
And what Doug was saying about the Beatitudes, you notice there it says you're blessed if you do this. Same thing here.
Yeah.
We will receive, you'll inherit a blessing at the end of verse 9 if you do what I just said.
yeah. If you will be a blessing to others, God will then bless you. Yeah. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And of course, in its golden rule form, obviously it's not verbatim, but it's ironic that the golden rule that gets repeated so often in schools and so forth, given the situation, actually does come from Jesus. He did basically say that. So it's that golden rule is really Jesus' rule. Anything else through verse 9? Verse 10. And so at this point, he includes passages from Psalms. He quotes Psalm 34, verses 12 through 16 from David. And it's interesting because notice how Peter applies David's words here. He says, "For he who would love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers," or as sometimes we read it in Psalm 34, to their cries. "But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." Question 7 of our notes for verses 7 through 12. Why does Peter quote from Psalm 34, 12 through 16? What connection does this have to the previous verse? And how is it especially applicable to the saints? So first of all, what connection does this have to the previous verse? Why does he quote this in connection? He says "for," verse 10. I mentioned this before. He is explaining what he has said in verses 8 and 9, or some aspect that he addresses in verses 8 and 9. That being the case, what is it that he's connecting from David's words to the words that he wrote?
Well, maybe one thing is this is nothing new. This is something God has had instituted even back in the Old Testament, a thousand years earlier.
Mm-hmm.
This is nothing new. He's just trying to emphasize this is how God and David taught.
Okay. And isn't it interesting that in the midst of what he quotes David as saying, David discusses both physical and spiritual blessings? Notice verse 10. "He who would love life and see good days." Doesn't mean that all our days are going to be good. But can I love my life? Can I love the blessings God has given me, even when, from a physical perspective, maybe things aren't that great? Can I still love the life that God has blessed me with? The nature of contentedness, okay, the idea of being content, it doesn't mean there aren't wants that I have. It just means I don't care about those as much as what I do have already. Okay, the idea of contentedness, as Paul uses it in Philippians chapter 4, is the idea of sufficient unto the day. God has supplied me, has blessed me with what I need today. And I'm not going to worry about tomorrow. I'll make plans for tomorrow. I'll do what I need to do to prepare for tomorrow, but I'm not going to worry about tomorrow. God has given me what I need today. Okay, and so instead of focusing on what I don't have, I focus on what I do have. That's contentedness. And to a certain extent, the way David describes this, he who would love life, not have a physically great life, that's not what David says, but he who would love life and see good days, even if those times can be difficult, the blessing of every day in this life, living with hope, living with courage, living with faith. Okay? The means by which I do that has everything to do with my heart and my actions. You know, it goes to my attitude and it goes to my behavior. He says, to he who would love life and see good days, if you're going to put God first and you want to be able to go through life and not have to worry about the things that you face, let him refrain his tongue from evil, his lips from speaking deceit. And of course, both of those, do those have impacts on other people, negative impacts? If I speak evil of others, if I deceive others, is that going to have a negative impact on others? Yeah. Okay. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Certainly there's the doing good for good's sake, but there's also doing good in the context of helping others. Let him seek peace and pursue it. So from an aspect of this life, if you want to have a life where each day you can love that day, regardless of what happens in it, you can be content, you can thank God for the blessing of the day, then here's what you do. You focus on serving God and don't focus on what you want. Because the type of individual that only focuses on what they want, they're the ones who give their tongues to evil, speaking evil about others, putting others down to exalt themselves, to deceive others into getting what they want. Let him turn away from evil, do good, seek peace, and pursue it. There's a sense of sacrifice there. But then also notice, in addition to the physical application of it, if you will, there's also the spiritual one. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous. His ears are open to their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. What does verse 12 then tell us that is, it's an extension of verse 11 and verse 10, but it is more than just having peace in life or having contentedness in life? What does verse 12 offer us that's more than just that?
What's the why to do it?
Say what?
The why.
Okay.
The real why.
Okay. And notice the characteristic of those who hears their prayers, whose ears are open to their prayers. What's the characteristic of people that God listens to and answers? Righteous. Righteous. Not self-righteous, okay, but those who submit to doing what God tells them to do. That's righteous. And of course, the just shall live by faith. Okay? Faith is kind of the core element here, that because I believe in God, because God has blessed me with the day, because He has given me what I need for today, therefore I am going to do good. I'm going to seek peace and pursue it. I am going to pray, cry to the Lord when I need Him. And certainly there's that physical aspect to it, just as verse 10 and 11 suggested, but there's also this overriding sense of blessing that God gives us. Do I make myself righteous? Do I make myself righteous? Okay, I choose to submit to God's will, right? But remember what it was said of Abraham? Abraham believed God, and what? It was accounted unto him for righteousness. Okay, in the end, and maybe justified might be a better way of saying it, in the sense that God acknowledges a person to be right in His sight, or not. That being the case, if I want to be right in the sight of God, if I want to not only have the physical blessings of peace and contentedness in life, but also have the hope of the next, what should I not do? The face of the Lord is against those who do what? Evil. Yeah. So So Peter quotes from the Psalms to show forth both the physical, and this is really on the heels of verse 9, knowing you were called to this that you may inherit a blessing. But verses 10 and 11, I can have that now. It's not so much an inheritance as much as it is that part can be current. To the brethren to whom Peter's writing, that could be current. Okay, they could be currently content in their life, even though they're suffering persecution. And that's where the second part of question 7 comes in, is how is this especially applicable to the saints to whom Peter's writing? It's because of the persecution they're facing. They can still love life and see good days even in the midst of persecution. But ultimately, the inheriting of a blessing, this is more acknowledging that what God has given me already, verse 10 and 11. He's given me hope. The actual inheritance really speaks more to verse 12, or this overarching concept of being justified in the sight of God, of having one day having that home of heaven. This is the reason why we hope. This is the reason why we have that conviction and that desire to do what's right. Because God says, this is what's waiting for you if you'll do what I tell you to do. So anything through verse 12 and question 7. Yes, ma'am.
Well, sometimes in our day and age, when it says content, we tend to think they sit back and do nothing.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is not what this says.
No.
This says that if you want to be content, you're doing good, you're pursuing peace, you're working for
Yes.
God. That's what makes you righteous.
Yeah.
Is that action. And those things in verse 12, those are things you're going to get now.
Yeah.
You know, God's listening to our prayers now.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Just once we get to heaven.
Yep.
So there's a current benefit
Sure.
to doing it as well. Not only the part in verse 10,
Yep.
but also the part in verse 12. Is
Yeah.
current.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, his ears are open to our prayers. And of course, he hears all. But the sense of in the New Testament and even in the Old Testament about God hearing the prayers of the righteous, he answers those prayers. Yeah. Okay. He heard the prayers of Cornelius. Okay. It didn't mean he answered them in the sense that maybe everything that Cornelius asked for or anything like that. Now, he did send Peter to tell him what he needed to do. But in the sense of hearing the prayers of sinners, as it was mentioned in the New Testament, God hears them, but he doesn't answer them as he does with those who are Christians, those who are faithful. Yeah. All right, anything else through verse 12? All right, verse 13. Who is he who will harm you if you become followers of what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. And do not be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. All right, question 1. In what way are we blessed when we suffer for righteousness' sake?
It's just like James chapter 1. Fortunate you if you fall into temptation. And you think, that's not fortunate. Fall into temptation.
Yeah.
We overcome it and become stronger because of it. We're blessed if we have to endure after we do good, and we're punished for it.
Terry shortened me minutes. Terry? Yeah, you're absolutely right, Doug. The concept of being blessed, especially as he says in verse 14, if you suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. Didn't Jesus himself, blessed are ye when you are persecuted for my name's sake? Okay? In the sense that while man may not offer justification, who will? God will. Okay? God will exalt you over all those who have harmed you. All right, we will stop there. We will pick up here verse 13, 14 next Sunday, and maybe we'll just try to kind of gain a couple of verses each class rather than trying to cover the whole stuff that we're behind here. But we're doing all right. We're doing okay. We've got a good ways this morning. Thank you, everybody.